Hello and welcome to today's program, Expert Take, U.S.-Korea Relations with former Deputy Secretary of State Stephen Biegun. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Jonathan Corrado. I am the Policy Director here at the Korea Society. We are delighted to be joined by our esteemed speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce him. Mr. Stephen E. Biegun is currently Senior Vice President of Global Public Policy at the Boeing Company. He was formerly, as everybody knows, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State and U.S. Special Representative for North Korea. He was responsible for leading U.S. efforts to achieve President Trump's goal of the final, fully verified denuclearization of North Korea. In this role, he directed all U.S. policy on North Korea, led negotiations, and spearheaded U.S. diplomatic efforts with allies and partners. Thank you so much for joining us today, Secretary Biegun.
Pleasure to be here.
That was busy. That's a big job. You had a lot to do.
Yeah, it makes me tired just hearing it.
We also want to thank the Kim Koo Foundation for making this program possible, and all of our in-person audience members and our 200 registered viewers who are watching the live stream right now. We are welcoming your questions live, and we're going to get to our in-person audience rather soon. So start thinking of your questions, and we'll get the microphones over to you after our recorded session. So good morning. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Biegun. It's really a pleasure to have you.
Sure, it's great to be here. You've been kind enough to have a long-standing invitation for me to join you here at the Korea Society, and I was in town today, so I was really glad to be able to combine this with that and look forward to the discussion.
Excellent. So you've done, I just want to sort of clarify what we're hoping to do with this conversation, because you've done so many good conversations of this nature in the past. So with NK News, you did the conversation with Jacko, the like 2.5 hour long podcast conversation that was like oral history for people to go through and really get a sense for what was going on, run up to Hanoi, during Hanoi, afterwards, a really unique conversation. Then you've done a couple of others as well that have been very clarifying and helpful. So we don't need to go back and do that all over again. I would refer people to that conversation in particular. But what I was hoping to do today is a little bit of lessons learned and then a little bit of forward application for what does it all mean given where we are today, which is, I think, quite a different place from where we were back then when you were in this role.
Yeah. So I was I made myself available for a couple long-form interviews after I left, and that partially was because of a discipline that we kept during the negotiations themselves, which was to be very careful and intentional with anything we said publicly, because it is almost certain that virtually any comments that we would make in public or on the record would be collected and studied by the North Koreans and then interpreted. In particular, while we didn't have any sort of ulterior motive, we wanted to be careful not to provide collections of words that or commentary that had the potential to be misconstrued or misrepresented or misunderstood. But at the same time, and so I was famously inaccessible to the media, particularly the very active and eager South Korean media. But I also am mindful that historical record is very important, not for one's legacy, but for the benefit of future negotiators or policymakers who will need to draw upon that record in order to have a starting point that's advanced beyond perhaps where we began our process. So one was Jacko Zwetslut's excellent, he's a great interviewer on NK News podcast, and the other was with Arms Control Daily.
Yep.
And so if you want, for those of you who want to understand more what we were thinking and what we were trying to do, I recommend those two sources. But I think there's an old saying that says you never enter a river twice in the same place. That
Right.
The flow of time and the passage of events very much changes the context in which the next set of negotiators will engage with the North Koreans, and so there's a lot that is different now,
Yep.
Jonathan, than was the case then. Of course, the geopolitical tensions, the war in Ukraine, the presence of North Korean troops outside the Korean Peninsula, to my knowledge, for the first time ever, certainly at this scale. There are a lot of implications for those things, both for North Korean interests and for North Korea's policies, and for U.S. interests as well. We'll have a new president on January 20th. The election's over, and I do expect this issue. I don't expect this issue to sit long before it begins to percolate towards the top of the agenda. And if it doesn't, then I expect North Koreans might themselves look for ways to make sure it does, and which is often the case.
So at the end of your tenure as Deputy Secretary of State, you sat down with the incoming Biden administration and you shared, quote, almost every detail of our actions with the North Koreans. And around that time, you said it looked like the Biden team wanted to continue the same sort of policy that you were doing, which was end goal of denuclearization, but this parallel and simultaneous progress along the four pillars of the Singapore Statement, along with the economic cooperation, which is something you kind of throw in there, I think is really good. So much has happened between now and then, or rather not happened. So if you were to give some guidance to the incoming Trump administration on what to look for, what would be effective, what would you say to them?
Yeah, so it took a few weeks for Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman to be confirmed. I've known Wendy for a very long time. We've worked together on a number of things. And once she was confirmed, I did go down and spend quite a bit of time with her and her team, walking them through where we left everything. They were, you'll recall, Jonathan, they were in the midst of a policy review at the beginning of the Biden administration. They revisited it, and as is often the case in a presidential transition, your starting point is we're not going to do anything that the predecessor did. Everything they did was either poorly ill-motivated or mistaken or don't represent the values of this new team. And of course, in the end, events and interests press you back into largely the same ruts in the road where the wheels have gone before. But we went through this at the beginning of their policy review, and I think I don't want to speak for her, but what I think Deputy Secretary Sherman was evaluating also is how much of her time should she allocate toward this portfolio. And I think that was an initial sign that the North Koreans picked up that it wasn't going to be, the Biden administration made a decision it wasn't going to be a top priority. It certainly wasn't going to be with the Deputy Secretary of State. And I heard from some of the people who were still talking secondhand, speaking with the North Koreans. I heard secondhand that North Koreans were questioning, was the Biden administration deprioritizing North Korea because the Deputy Secretary of State was no longer going to handle it. They'd appointed Sung Kim to be dual-headed, the special representative and our ambassador to Indonesia. My reaction to that was, well, when I was Deputy Secretary, they wouldn't talk to me. So what was the what cachet does that bring? And certainly the Deputy Secretary of State is not going to devote the amount of time that I did because of my legacy commitment to the process on a daily basis to track this portfolio when there's so many other challenges around the world. So I would say that it wasn't as much a policy signal as well as a practical judgment of time management that it wasn't a high priority issue. Now, Sung Kim was one of the finest diplomats I've worked with during my tenure at the State Department, and putting this policy with him while he was ambassador to Indonesia in and of itself was not a sign of disinterest, but also there was no singular focus. But a chicken and egg, there was also no driving set of events that was causing it to be a singular focus. So the Biden administration, basically under the Biden administration, the lack of interest on the North Korean side combined with just practical decision-making on time management led this issue to atrophy inside the government. And so, I encouraged a an active patience, not a strategic patience, that active diplomacy, engaged, frequent travel,
Yeah.
be present in the region, signaling constantly what their intentions were,
Yeah.
whether they were the same as ours or not. But I think so many other events consumed the time and attention of the Biden administration. And one has to recall that during our last year and during their first year, really their first 2 years, the COVID pandemic had North Korea absolutely hermetically sealed
Yeah.
to travelers and visitors from any country, including ones that the North Koreans would have considered friendly. So it was a challenging environment. As far as what's possible, um, I do think that, without a doubt, the North Koreans were following our electoral process as closely as anybody around the world.
Yeah.
I remember when we were meeting with Chairman Kim Jong-un at the DMZ in the summer of 2019, in June, when President Trump invited him to the DMZ during a state visit to South Korea, that standing on the side with a number of senior officials from the North Korean side that I knew, I was peppered with questions about the state of the U.S. election, about the president's reelection hopes. And this very much, I think, shapes the North Koreans' thinking on timing and what kind of initiatives they'll do as well. Of course, that was still almost 7 months before we we woke up to the COVID pandemic. And at the time, I have to tell you candidly, it looked pretty certain like President Trump was a lock on reelection at that point in the summer of 2019. That's certainly how the North Koreans saw it. And I think they were inclined to continue negotiating at that point as well. And there was at least some limited contact all the way up until the end of that year when the pandemic hit and North Korea just completely shut down.
Yeah, yeah. So you anticipate continued interest from the North Koreans and potentially revving up right now to re-engage with the next Trump administration.
Yeah, well, I suggested, and if he does it, I'm going to take credit for it. I suggested that Chad Carroll, who runs the NK News, that he put a countdown clock on his on the front page of his website on when the first Trump tweet happens on North Korea. Although the president doesn't tweet anymore, doesn't go on Twitter anymore, but I do think there will be some engagement. It's not the top priority, either for President Trump. At least he hasn't made it his top priority. And although he has addressed it even in the course of the campaign, with some references to North Korea and to his personal like for Kim Jong-un, that wouldn't have been lost on the North Koreans either.
Yeah. One of the interesting bits of alchemy that helped the Singapore summit come together, that season of diplomacy in 2018, was the active role of South Korea. And now we're in such a different place today. So how do you evaluate the role of South Korea going forward, especially with this new change from the North Korean government on disavowing its pursuit of unification?
Yeah. So again, so much has changed. The political constellation was dramatically different in 2017 and 2018 than it is today. You had a progressive government come to power in South Korea, which of course is going to traditionally be much more aligned with the idea of negotiating with North Korea. You had a very conservative government under Prime Minister Abe in Japan, who was torn about the idea of negotiating with North Korea. On the one hand, there were some very important issues that Japan wanted progress on, the abductees, some sort of final, complete resolution of the issue of the abductees, and then also Japan was deeply worried about the burgeoning short-range ballistic missile capabilities in South Korea. It was always a challenge, though, for me as a negotiator. While the Japanese were excellent partners, you could visibly see how torn they were when they could never decide if they were happy when we were making progress or more alarmed when we were making progress. And I think part of that was because they were worried that the issues that were most important to Japan, even if they were on the train as it left the station, were going to be towards the back of the train, not towards the front of the train.
Yeah.
And it's true. And I was always candid with them that addressing the nuclear weapons program was the central priority for us among the sets of priorities. In South Korea, I don't see a lot of sign that the Yoon government has embraced the idea that negotiations with North Korea can enhance South Korea's security. And in fact, to the contrary, as all of you know, South Korea has moved in some ways very impressively to strengthen cooperation with Japan, to deepen its role in the U.S. Decision making, particularly around consultations for the potential use of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula, but also robust military exercises. A lot of the things, quite honestly, as I was watching this from outside, while these might be perfectly appropriate for the moment, it felt like we were just pulling old plays out of the playbook too, and like everybody was going through playing their part that they had to play. We had to do muscular, robust exercises. North Koreans had to fire missiles into the sea, and it just, to me, having seen much more potential for negotiations and progress in this relationship, it felt like nobody was really demonstrating any imagination in this, any initiative, and everybody was just falling back into their caricatures on all sides, and so that's one thing about the incoming president, is that he's not predictable, and he's not constrained by convention, and he doesn't look at that old playbook and say, "Wow, these are great plays. Let's call them again." In fact, to the contrary, he's the guy who says, "Are you kidding me? This war ended more than 70 years ago, and we still have 30,000 U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula. What geniuses have been in charge of our North Korea policy for the past 70 years?" And there's a certain everyman common sense in that observation. Is there another way? And that's what we were testing.
So there's this, when I teach my class on North Korea at Columbia at Stony Brook University, I assign some of the interviews that you've done, the Arms Control Association one and the podcast for NK News. And I ask my students to ponder the question whether it's incumbent on the larger power, the U.S., to make some sort of concession up front to get things going, to make some sort of gamble, to kickstart things, because North Korea, with its inherent vulnerability, just is not going to do that. Would you agree with that proposition?
Not entirely. I never wanted to make concessions for simply a willingness by the North Koreans to engage, and I think one of the minimum requirements that we have to expect is that they'll sit down and talk. And North Koreans tend to leverage that and ration that in exchange for rewards. And my view was pretty hard line on this, that there will be no rewards for simply talking. For front loading some beneficial steps in exchange for progress in some of these issues, trying to create positive momentum up front in understanding legally and constitutionally what authorities the president has that allow him to do that without the Congress necessarily, or without waiting for the Congress, so on. We put a lot of thought into that, about how we could breathe life into this very quickly, but not just for talking. Now there are things that we can and have done in the past that aren't concessions to North Korea. In the past, we provided humanitarian assistance. We've been open to other types of engagement beyond official engagement between governments, visa policies, things like that. Those are things that I think reasonably are available to create an environment in which you can talk, but not concessions in advance. But Jonathan, I was pretty hardline view on this, that there's no rewards for just talking, but you can create a better mood around it in order to facilitate that.
So if I'm remembering correctly, you've written that one of the constraints was just this lack of communication and a willingness on the North Korean side to talk. And I believe you said you had around 8 engagements with the North Koreans in total during your whole time.
Yep.
So how do we get around this? How do we incentivize them to talk? Because as long as they view it as a gift to the United States to engage in these talks, then it seems like there'll be some limitations.
Yeah. So we talked about there's a number of things that are different today than from when I took on this portfolio in 2018. They're not just at the disposition of governments or the governments that are in power. We had a robust NGO and aid presence in the international community had a robust NGO and aid presence inside North Korea. A number of organizations doing fantastic work with health or clean drinking water and improving agricultural yields, things like that were just humanitarian, purely humanitarian, and quite honestly, should, in my view at least, shouldn't even be leveraged for purposes of foreign policy concessions. We had North Korean participants of various calibers participating in a wide range of Track 2 dialogues globally. We had international partners around the world who had North Korean embassies in their capitals and had their embassies in North Korean capitals. Mm-hmm. Almost all of that is wiped away now. Yeah. Almost none of that is there. So our engagement and our channels of communication with North Korea were constrained for sure, and it was really a choke point in our ability to deepen the engagement and move towards the kind of agreement that I thought was possible. Mm-hmm. But it just the choke point of the long periods of silence from North Korea, that even though that was supplemented by all the other means of engagement that were out there, it was a central challenge for our diplomacy, and it's one that we have to interpret as a sign of North Korean seriousness as well. They would literally, during different periods of that 2.5 years, they would go silent on us completely. Wow. For month, 2 months, 3 months with no communications whatsoever. Sometimes we would try to do a taxonomy to figure out what happened. Was it a human rights resolution at the UN or something? What might they be responding to? Yeah. And sometimes it was completely invisible to us what was causing it, which might have been internal issues and that we had no knowledge of. It could be a health issue, could be an internal disagreement, and so on. And so if the North Koreans don't choose to communicate and engage like that, it makes it very challenging. And that's something that, for example, during the six-party talks was not a challenge. It was ample communication there. Yeah. The so-called New York Channel here through the DPRK mission to the United Nations, there were long periods where they were absolutely forbidden at with threat of punishment to even engage with us, to have a conversation.
Wow, very different. Okay, so let's go on to an assessment that you've made that I think is just brilliant, which is you've said that the fundamental reason for North Korea's nuclear program isn't necessarily security, but rather mobilization around the ideology of the Kim leadership. Maybe you'd also want to throw in a desire to hedge their security dependence on Russia and China as well. But I was hoping you can unpack this assessment a little bit and then tell us, what does that mean in terms of pursuing a policy that's going to get results? Because the U.S., if it was fundamentally about security, the U.S. can address that, right? We could take meaningful steps to really substantially address that need. But on the other hand, if it's the case that it's about this domestic politics, it's very difficult for the U.S. to address that.
I would love to address it, Jonathan, but the reason why I spoke about it previously is because it really is a central challenge. I mean, how do you address that issue when the possession of a nuclear weapon is a defining feature of the regime's in the regime's view, the defining feature of it being a world-class power, equivalent for anyone else. In a sense, a nuclear weapon is a great equalizer. There's no question about it. So, would North Korea have gotten nearly the attention they got from President Trump in 2017 and 18 if they didn't have a nuclear weapon?
Right. Yeah.
This is a dilemma, and it's a dilemma, and it's not the only dilemma in our in American diplomacy with North Korea. Another one is that China is most supportive. China works in most closely in partnership with us at moments when the Korean Peninsula looks like it's going to explode into violence. But the more successful we are with our diplomacy in easing tensions on the Korean Peninsula, the less devoted China is to that partnership.
That's a great point.
And so, these are really complex dilemmas that we have to work through. So, in thinking about the prestige and importance that North Korea, the regime in North Korea draws from being a nuclear power among the top ranks of countries in the world, you think about the nations that have nuclear weapons plus North Korea. How do you redirect that to other achievements, like a rapidly improving prosperity for the people, or engagement with other countries, ambassadors and embassies, and being recognized and legitimized in the eyes of the world in that process? The challenge here, Jonathan, is that all of that I just described, all those benefits that flow from a successful outcome in a negotiation with us, for example, are more appealing to us than they are to North Korea, because North Korea is a totalitarian dictatorship. And I'm sorry, call me a skeptic, but I don't think Kim Jong-un loses sleep at night over the condition of his people outside Pyongyang. And so when we start talking about how we're going to create a better world, a brighter future for North Korea, I think it's just lost. I don't think that's that. There's the old saying of designing bait that appeals to the fisherman rather than appeals to the fish. And this is a classic example of us projecting what we would want.
Right, exactly.
If that was our country, is we want our people to live better and live at peace. Now, maybe there's an iota of humanity in the leadership or in the regime that also wants that, but that is not an either or for them. It's an all of the above, and that's kind of where they were.
Yeah, and their closest ally, Vladimir Putin, famously said that Kim Jong-un will let his people eat grass rather than cave into sanctions. So that's their best friend.
And he said that with respect, I might add, too, and affection. It's a tough place for sure. And in a dictatorship, job one is to maintain the dictatorship.
Right.
And so that could not be an objective of our diplomacy.
Yeah.
President Trump did on a number of occasions fit into his statements or his tweets or his letters. If you review them or what's reported on them, you'll see it, where he is appealing to Chairman Kim to engage or to do something, and expresses a confidence that we will transform this relationship under your leadership. That was a subtle but intentional statement by President Trump to Chairman Kim that he wasn't trying to bring about regime change.
Right.
But if the incentives that we were offering the North Koreans will so fundamentally change North Korea that you can't maintain that totalitarian dictatorship, it may not be a policy for regime change, but it is kind of going to change the regime.
Yeah.
Because you can't sustain that brutal dictatorship absent a constant state of war with all of your and threat with all of your neighbors. You can't sustain it without the complete control of information, without being able to force people to endure the most severe hardships possible, without an apparatus to repress dissent and political disloyalty or ambiguity, at least in the country. None of that works. The dictatorship doesn't work without all the rest of it in place.
Right.
And what we were offering would have made it impossible to have all that in place.
Perhaps perceived as a bit of a Trojan horse. I mean, the prospect of a bunch of South Korean chaebols arriving in North Korea, what could be more threatening?
Tourists, North Koreans traveling outside of North Korea without political filtering.
Yeah.
More embassies, business people.
Yeah.
Think about it. I mean, it would be a beautiful thing, honestly.
Right.
But if job one is to maintain your dynastic dictatorship, I'm not so sure that's inviting.
And that's why Vietnam was such an interesting choice for the meeting place in the Hanoi summit, because, okay, here's a, communist country, socialist country, maintaining one party rule. You got China right next door,
It was a brilliant choice. And it was a compromise. We were talking before the session started that it was a bit of a negotiation with the North Koreans over where the second summit would be held. The first was obviously in Singapore. The North Koreans wanted the second to be in Mongolia, in Ulaanbaatar. For our part, we were suggesting Da Nang. Da Nang had just come off of the successful hosting of an APEC summit, and beautiful city, coastal city in Vietnam, modern infrastructure, hotels. In the end, we settled on Hanoi, and part of that was logistics because Chairman Kim took his train from Pyongyang to the Vietnamese border, and then drove in a motorcade from the border down to Hanoi. But the Singapore summit, to invite the North Koreans there, it's not like Singapore was off limits to North Koreans. Singapore also has diplomatic relations with North Korea, but to profile Singapore when the North Koreans came in was to show them something that must have, at some level, seemed unattainable. Mm-hmm. That it is such a prosperous and developed economy that it would almost be like visiting Disney World in a sense, that you just have to suspend belief. But visiting Hanoi, it would have certainly been possible for our North Korean interlocutors to see the Vietnamese modeling several things that were available to them. Mm-hmm. One was a transformation of their government that still permitted one-party rule, but also was delivering outcomes for the society that, on balance, were accepted by the society. Right. Not democracy, but outcomes like stability, a growing economy, even excellent reaction to the COVID pandemic. Vietnam was fantastic on that. Vietnam presents a model for normalizing relations with the United States after a war, after an adversarial period, and now Vietnam is one of America's closest partners in Asia. Vietnam and Hanoi specifically model how economic development can bring greater prosperity to the people, while sustaining the system of government that is currently in place in Vietnam, and while normalizing those relations with the U.S. There's occasional frictions with us in Vietnam, but they're not determinative of the entire relationship. Right. So all that I thought was great. But truth is, North Korea is not Vietnam either, and that pathway has to start with the North Koreans wanting that pathway. Yeah. And us too, just as it started in the 1980s with the Vietnamese wanting that pathway. Yeah. And us too.
You need Doi Moi, you need Deng Xiaoping to come in and liberalize the economy first. Yep. So much lies in that.
Yep. And also, it has to be iterative in that you can't overload it with expectations up front, but you should have confidence that the more that works, the more opportunity you have to try the things that will work as well. Mm-hmm. And so, we're at a point now where the United States has defense cooperation with Vietnam. Mm-hmm. 50 years ago, we were fighting a war in Vietnam. Yeah. I mean, this is just over 50 years ago. I mean, this is a remarkable transformation, and but nobody would have in the 1990s when we normalized with Vietnam in 1995, I think it was. Nobody was projecting that. Yeah. They just saw, okay, we're going to have embassies. Right. But here we are.
And so, I mean, it begs the question, what if we could radically transform North Korea's security relationships in a way that would be appealing to them to address one of those other core reasons for their nuclear weapons? Of course, North Korea is extremely cognizant and anxious about its over reliance on China as a trade partner, as a security partner. And there have been some interests on the part of the United States to say, hey, okay, we can help you address that. And Vietnam's an interesting model as a hedger going in between very successfully. I'm thinking that the new intensification of relations between Moscow and Pyongyang has fundamentally scrambled that. And so now North Korea can do its two sides against the middle thing without having to make any major concessions at all. So the US has a little bit less of a pitch to make there in terms of the security transformation.
Yeah. The without a doubt, even without North Korean direct involvement, the Russia's brutal attack on Ukraine has scrambled the geopolitics in a way that I think the North Koreans see as opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think it's unfortunate. I think it's a mistake. There's in some quarters a view that the North Koreans are big winners in all of this. I think the consequences of what they're doing, I don't think they've really thought through the full consequences and the lasting effect of what they're doing by sending these 8 or 10,000 soldiers to fight against Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's more an analytical view because it's not in my writ to worry about the future stability of the North Korean regime per se.
Right.
But I'm thinking that they're in uncharted territory right now. This is fundamentally contradictory to Juche. This attacks the foundational philosophy that the North Korean regime has used to rationalize its dictatorship for decades. North Korea is now a dependent upon Russia for aid and for technology in ways that it was loath to be in the past. And North Korea has extended itself outside its hermit kingdom, outside its traditional isolated orbit, to send its troops into a foreign conflict for the first time since 1948. And in doing so, they are exposing themselves to geopolitical forces that they have never had to contend with before. Some will be advantageous to them. They have a partner in Russia now that they can depend upon. They have a counterweight to China if they need it, and they have a counterweight to us as well. But they also have essentially declared war against a country, Ukraine, which is in an existential battle for its sovereignty and independence. And I don't know that the Ukrainians ever gave thought to what if North Korea bites back. Mm-hmm. And the Ukrainians have a very long reach. Their ability to strike targets deep inside Russia with unmanned aerial vehicles. One does not need to strain credulity to think about a ship somewhere out in the Western Pacific launching unmanned aerial vehicles to strike missile plants or artillery shell plants in North Korea. This will fundamentally scramble the geopolitics because, traditionally the North Korean counter to that is we'll threaten or we'll attack South Korea.
Yeah.
South Korea could have absolutely nothing to do with this.
Right.
I mean, it might be a target of convenience, but the Ukrainians could do it.
Right.
And what are the North Koreans going to do then?
Right.
They're going to fire a nuclear weapon at Ukraine?
Mm-hmm.
Are they going to send troops? Well, they already did.
Yeah.
They have committed first foul in the eyes of the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians will have a long reach, and they will have a long memory. And so North Korea has fundamentally ventured into uncharted territory here, and I'm not at all inclined to declare this as a sign that they're a big winner in this war.
That's a really good point. And you have this contingent of 10,000 soldiers who are now outside the country, How many will defect? What will they see? What will they learn?
Captured,
Yep.
defected, killed.
Hmm.
I think the one thing that North Korean regime probably calculated was killed.
Hmm.
I'm told, I don't know if this is true secondhand, but I'm told that families of those soldiers are all in isolation.
How horrible.
It's a lot of families, obviously,
Yeah.
but that there's an attempt to insulate the society from
Yeah.
any of the blowback. I highly doubt there will be any letters home from the
Hmm.
battlefield.
Hmm.
This is a it wouldn't be in the nature of North Korea to send its soldiers and post obituaries and mourn the fallen and so on.
Right.
That's not going to happen. But there are plenty of ways that this could humiliate the North Koreans too. If the performance of their soldiers is inferior, and also if some are captured.
Yeah.
You say defected, but captured too.
Yeah. And although the North Korean soldiers are incredibly disciplined in terms of not having any social media, of course, but not otherwise communicating with the outside world, Russian soldiers have proven to be tremendously undisciplined, taking lots of videos of the North Koreans getting their disguises. They're supposed to be camouflaged as Russian soldiers, but here are Russian soldiers videotaping that and then posting it to publicly accessible social networks. Um, so the idea that the North Korean interaction with these Russian soldiers who are, first of all, airing out their dirty laundry, disparaging them. We have recordings of Russian soldiers disparaging the fitness of North Korean troops. And of course, there's going to be some problems with fitness of working together. It's not like the North Koreans are being sent out as one division, all intact. No, it looks like they're being placed within Russian units, taught 100 Russian words, get out there, good luck. Well, there's going to be a lot of communication problems, and they're going to take those back to the home front afterwards. We've been fighting someone else's war, and they don't even like us very much.
Yep. As I said, it's not in my remit to worry about the implications of this for the North Korean regime. But not to wear out this topic, but the other one is that I think other countries now see North Korea very differently than they did before they sent their troops in.
Yeah.
It was a country that other nations may have worried about or had some alarm about their capabilities. But if you're sitting in Poland, you're sitting in the Baltic states, and your hierarchy of problems, North Korea doesn't rate very high up there, or didn't used to, but now it does. There will be lasting effects from this. Now, we present a scenario where these troops actually perform admirably, and they are exactly the assistance that the Russians need, that Putin needs, in order to overrun the Ukrainians, at least in Kursk, if not inside Ukraine as well. I mean, there's a scenario there, but quite honestly, I'm not one inclined to believe that to work that way.
Ukrainians are fighting for their very lives.
Yes.
Yeah.
And honorably and nobly, but unfortunately, the last thing they needed was 8 or 10,000 foreign troops added to the Russian forces.
So I wanted to pivot a little bit into a line of questioning where we try to address some of the problems in the U.S. side understanding the North Koreans, and then also the North Korean side having trouble to understand us. So in your interview with Jacko, you talked about how we do struggle to understand one another's institutions and psychologies. You provide the good example of the North Koreans being upset about what a member of Congress said or what the New York Times published, which is, of course, out of the control of the White House. That's just not how a democracy works. And then for your own side, for your part, you were required to do a lot of improvisation because of the communication problem. And then right in the middle of your engagement, well, after Hanoi, the agency that was responsible for working with you, United Freight Department, suddenly that switched, and now you have to deal with the foreign ministry. So how can we understand a more nuanced understanding of the North Koreans in order to interact with them more effectively?
There's so much that transpired during that period of diplomacy that someday I hope for the opening of the state archives in North Korea that I can pore over these things and satisfy my curiosity on what were they thinking. And also, we tried through every way possible, using every resource available to us as government officials, to understand what the thinking is, what's happening inside North Korea, what might be driving their decision making. But it was always going to be imperfect. It is a completely closed society. It's a dictatorship. They ration engagement and control it carefully, and so it was always going to be that. But the one thing that would be unforgivable, and what we had to really work at, is at a minimum we need to understand ourselves, and that's accessible to us, and we have to organize ourselves properly. And so when I think about the negotiation, when I raised that anecdote in the podcast, my point was that the North Koreans scrutinize everything we say and do so closely that it's imperative upon us to have message discipline. We can't control think tanks, and we don't. We can't control Congress from the executive branch, and we don't. But we could control our message, and so we worked very hard at internal discipline on our message, because our weakness is as a sprawling democracy. We have a much wider range of voices in our society. We have think tanks, we have former officials and experts, we have journalists, we have columnists, we have Congress and so on. One of the tendencies and one of the challenges I kind of peripherally referenced earlier in designing the bait for the fish is that we tend also to project on the other side our logic and our system and our priorities. And so, as I said, well, surely they want a better life for their people in the countryside, but maybe not. But when they look at us and say, CSIS and the New York Times editorial page and a member of Congress are all saying things that must be coordinated and directed, they're projecting their system on us. Because the truth is, if you had a pseudo think tank in North Korea, if you had Nodong Shinmun, and if you had a member of the Korean Workers' Party all saying something, it would have been directed. So they're projecting. They project on us too. The one thing that we tried to control most was what we said publicly, and we would when they would chide us over something like you described, that anecdote I mentioned, we would remind them that we only speak for ourselves. But then we were very careful about how we spoke for ourselves. But we're not always perfect either, because but it's a big sprawling government. Treasury Department doing sanctions and Commerce Department doing trade actions and different parts of the State Department, even Human Rights Bureau versus the regional bureaus and so on. So the agility thing is the North Koreans' problem, not ours. We can be agile at the negotiating table. We can hit a dead end and we can kind of think about, well, wait, let's try it this way. And even on the fly, we can be changing our course or changing our approach to something to see if we can advance the particular matter that we're negotiating. And the North Koreans are completely rigid. Their negotiators have received directions. Oftentimes they have rehearsed and role played to prepare for these negotiations. And at risk of arrest, if not death, they are compelled to stick rigidly to that, and they're monitored. If you're in North Korea, for sure, they're monitored during that whole process, real time. If you're outside North Korea, they have people embedded in their group that are reporting on this independently, but also they are required to constantly break and consult with Pyongyang, and they're just absolutely rigid. And so is another conclusion I reached too, Jonathan, is that another one of our mistakes when we negotiate with the North Koreans is to imagine that we're negotiating with a person. You have a counterpart. So I had a counterpart across the table from me, their lead negotiator, and we do most of the discussion and negotiation with some consultation with our respective parties. But when you're negotiating with North Korea, you're negotiating with a system. You're not negotiating with an individual. And that system is visible and invisible. Invisible in the whatever speakers or video is being captured in the room, which it is for sure, invisible in terms of how their decision making is being made inside the regime, and whether or not there's, my South Korean counterparts scoffed at the idea, but I have long thought that there is something of a collective decision-making process inside North Korea. That's not to say Chairman Kim doesn't rule with absolute authority, but even a dictator has to have the feel of the room when they are presenting an idea. They can tell if the applause is just a little bit softer, or if the eyes go down to the table a little too quickly. And I have no doubt that during the course of this diplomacy, there were points at which Kim Jong-un faced resistance internally, because I was there and present when he would make commitments to the Secretary of State or the Secretary or the President about certain things being done, and then the system would go silent on us for months afterwards. It was only explainable by the possibility that he was facing some internal questioning or resistance on the course that he'd committed to.
So what's it like to be in the room with him? I've heard that he's confident, that he's commanding, he's on top of his issues.
He's clearly never heard the word no. In our discussions about the summit location, we perhaps a bit too hastily set aside the idea of Ulaanbaatar. We had already gone through a review process in advance of the meeting with the White House, the logistics and the travel challenges and the ability to accommodate the thousands of international journalists that were coming. It seemed a logistical nightmare in Mongolia. Not that Mongolia wasn't a great partner in this, though. I have to say, Mongolia, at a few points along this process, also sent very constructive messages to the North Koreans, supportive of what we were trying to do. But logistically, it just wasn't going to work. And we were perhaps a little too quick moving on to alternatives, and Chairman Kim bristled. And it was clear that when he proposed an idea, it was given all due consideration before we tried another idea. And we went back, and it was probably a little bit abrupt. I don't know that we've ever talked about this publicly, but one of the ideas he tabled was to do it on a U.S. aircraft carrier. To pull a U.S. aircraft carrier into the waters off Korea. But we couldn't figure out how to do that, because the only way to get onto the aircraft carrier would be likely a U.S. helicopter, because we wouldn't allow a non-U.S. military helicopter. Logistically, that was at least kicked around. And
I can't believe that was his suggestion. Think of the imagery, the messaging.
Yeah. Look, when you're meeting, one of the, perhaps, it is what it is. I'm not going to say it's an advantage or disadvantage, but in a dictatorship, if you're talking to the top of the house, you can cover about anything. Making it happen, executing it, can be challenging.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine an underling ever raising an issue like that without fearful of the fate that would await them.
Yeah.
But in any event, it was the point of that was it was clear that in that system, what he can say anything, and what he says, people do usually.
Any sense for the role of Kim Yo-jong? Don't know the extent of your interaction with her.
So she was pretty guarded, in that she really strove to play a backseat role, despite our efforts to engage her in the discussions. But she was always present.
Yeah.
So in my first meeting in Pyongyang, it was Chairman Kim and Kim Yo-jong and the interpreter. And that was a 2.5 hour meeting with Secretary Pompeo and I, and she was there for the entire meeting. She didn't say anything.
Huh.
She took notes. Those of you who follow this more closely will know that she's always kind of policing the perimeter of his gaggles, of his movements. If you watched on television when President Moon Jae-in and his wife arrived in Pyongyang for the summit in the fall of 2018, she was kind of constantly patrolling the perimeter, making sure people are in the right place, and the
Yeah.
general touches, and then just keeping a general eye on things. I think she's certainly close to her brother, to Chairman Kim, and she certainly commands great respect and authority in his presence, even
Yeah.
from everyone around her. It's like it's clear that she's royalty, if you will, but trying to engage her, trying to speak with her, can be challenged to draw her out. The only time I've really seen her let her guard down a little bit and light up was when in the course of the meeting between President Trump and Chairman Kim, happening at the DMZ, which was a 2+2. So it was then Foreign Minister Young Ho and Chairman Kim with Secretary Pompeo and President Trump, and then interpreters. The rest of us were outside in a hold area at the DMZ, and we introduced Ivanka Trump to Kim Yo Jong. There's some symmetries there. Prominent female relative of the leader, and I could see her beaming. It was an interesting moment where she let some of her own personal emotions show through, but otherwise she was extraordinarily guarded and very pleasant but distant. Very hard to reach.
She's in a tough place because, of course, there is no number two in North Korea.
Yeah, well, as I've said before, dictators don't have deputy dictators. Is your deputy dictator is your coup plotter, or nobody wants to be the anointed one. And by the way, no dictator wants an anointed one either.
Yeah.
Brutus to Caesar.
And Jang Song-taek maybe knows what it feels like to be the deputy dictator of North Korea.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly all that was behind his killing, but the fact that he was an independent source of influence, potentially including with China, certainly didn't extend his life.
Any sense about, since you've done this engagement and then afterwards, Kim Ju-ae, his daughter, has become this darling of North Korean media, popping up. It looks like take your daughter to work day watching ICBM's launch. So clearly being groomed, or at least trying to be positioned for some sort of role. Any thoughts there on succession?
So it's all since I was there. It is a very young age. It's less her gender than her age that surprises me. And of all of the accounts, some fanciful that I've heard about Kim Jong-un having health issues, the endeavoring to groom a successor or to legitimize her in some way, at least at this point, it really puzzles me as to why. And I wonder if there was a sense that he needed to begin that process earlier. His father didn't begin that process until he was in absolute decline. And there was even some mystery, in the passing of the baton from grandfather to father and father to son as to who might actually be the successor. This is it's less that she's a woman that she's so young that it puzzles me.
Inside the North Korea or Korea studies field, there's all these tensions between priorities, and they get pitched to us as opposite ends of the spectrum, although I'm not so sure that they are. So one example of this is humanitarian versus human rights, right? These two communities, a little bit of tribalism and butting of heads. And then the other one would be deterrence versus more
denuclearization
engagement
versus arms control.
Right. So how do you look at these?
The human rights issue is obviously very important, and human rights in North Korea, in any objective measure, are terribly observed. But the greatest human rights improvement on the Korean Peninsula is not likely to come from a sternly worded United Nations resolution. To me, I understand that that's a principled statement for those who believe, and I do, firmly in human rights, but it also feels a little performative to me at times, these kind of statements, because they're not doing anything to improve the human rights. And transforming the Korean Peninsula in a way that President Trump had in mind would have undoubtedly led to the greatest improvement in human rights that the Korean Peninsula had experienced since the onset of communist rule in North Korea. But that, again, is why I think also what we were proposing wasn't entirely attractive to the regime, because having a population dependent upon the state, for example, even the introduction of markets in North Korea in the early 2000s diminished the power of the state, because people could negotiate their livelihoods and their daily existence without the government's intervention through private marketplaces, and so these things do come at a cost for the dictatorship. Nonetheless, I think what we were trying to do with a transformative negotiation would have immensely improved human rights on the Korean Peninsula. On deterrence or isolation, really, versus engagement, I fall largely on the engagement side with practically everything. I wouldn't be intimidated into engaging. I wouldn't be threatened into engaging. But I also don't think there's any concession in engagement. And I don't think we should lead the North Koreans to believe that for them that also requires us to make some concession. That I just don't think that's sensible. On arms control versus denuclearization, this is one that is very much being debated in the Korea expert community. I fall on the side of must be denuclearization. Even if de facto any negotiation that we have with the North Koreans leads to a very long process of denuclearization.
Right.
The end state that both sides have to agree to is denuclearization. Otherwise, there are secondary and tertiary interests that we have that will be deeply affected. If we legitimize and accept North Korea as a nuclear weapons state, we are risking unleashing a round of nuclear proliferation, which I believe will not end with North Korea, South Korea, Japan. Even some have said that the country that has the place that has the most incentive is Taiwan.
Of course.
What a great equalizer, in the same way that the North Koreans have used the nuclear weapon to equalize their conventional inferiority on the Korean Peninsula. And so I think the Chinese get this, honestly, and we've discussed that our policies towards North Korea are equally weighted in our global nonproliferation strategy. But so I don't fall on the side of arms control. Could you reach an agreement that for a period of time looks like arms control limitations and reductions and transparencies and ultimately elimination? Yeah, and that's that iterative process I described, which really I think has to be at the core of any outcome in a negotiation with North Korea, where the outcomes that you ultimately want may not be conceivable on day one, but you have to use an iterative process to build confidence and trust and reduce hostility in the Korean Peninsula, improve transparencies, improve a sense of security. Possibly the regime begins to transform in some ways during that period. And then you get to the point where nuclear weapons just don't make sense, that they're a danger or they're an expense. Now, that's probably a pretty pie-in-the-sky notion right now. But I think it's the only way we get started down that way. As attractive to some as something like the so-called Libya model, which really isn't the model that was pursued in Libya. It's been reconstructed. Libya didn't have a nuclear weapon when they agreed to end their weapons of mass destruction pursuit.
Yeah.
They had chemical weapons.
Right.
And they may have had ambitions, but long-term ambitions for a nuclear weapon. North Korea is a nuclear weapons state.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question about it. They have a nuclear weapon. It's going to be a very different process than they're going to give everything to us up front, and then we'll talk.
Right. And I mean, just sounds so intuitively appealing, right? The way that you present it. So the question is whether the North Koreans were hip to that, whether they were feeling that appeal.
So I go back to my previous comment, Jonathan. We need to be careful not to apply our logic or the outcomes that we want and assign them or project them on the North Koreans.
Yeah. Last question is about China. You mentioned that one reason we didn't get a Christmas gift in 2019 when that was offered or promised or threatened by the North Koreans, some sort of weapons test, was that the Chinese interceded and prevented that from happening. A few weeks ago, the Biden administration approached the Chinese ambassador and asked for some help in convincing the North Koreans not to move forward with their military support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I'm just wondering if China's leverage or interests in helping promote stability on the Korean Peninsula and elsewhere has really waned in between 2019 and now.
So the roles that each of them plays has changed as well. Russia's primary consideration in the North Korea period of North Korea diplomacy was to have no daylight with China. Even then, Russia was eager to be in lockstep with China, and Russia's secondary motivation was to have a seat at the table as a major power.
Yeah.
And so, if we could get China on board, Russia usually came along as part of the deal, because Russia's principal objective was to have no daylight with China.
Yeah.
I have to say, though, that we had excellent cooperation with China and Russia during that period. My Chinese counterpart, Vice Minister Kong Chuan-yo, who went on to become ambassador to Japan, I think he's now retired, and my counterpart from Russia, Deputy Foreign Minister Igor Morgulov, who is now moved on to be the Russian ambassador to Beijing. They were helpful. They at times with us would strategize on how we could move forward, not to deceive the North Koreans or undermine the North Koreans, but what formula might deliver the most success. And they were supportive of our engagement. China wanted the same outcome that we wanted, at least at a level of stabilizing the Korean Peninsula and addressing the nuclear weapons. So China was inclined to be supportive, and Russia came along as part of the package deal, as I said. That's not to say that parts of each of these countries or each of their systems wasn't doing things that we found objectionable during that period, but the overall thrust of my counterparts was positive. We did not ask them to intervene at the end of 2019 with the North Koreans. We did make abundantly clear that a provocative act from North Korea had the potential to completely derail our efforts to negotiate a diplomatic outcome that both China and Russia, at the time at least, were aligned with. What happened this is only circumstantial, but I have a high level of conviction. What happened is, as we went into the fall, and so keep in mind where we were. Hanoi had ended without an agreement early in the year. Mid-year, President Trump had seen Chairman Kim in the DMZ. In October, I had my last meeting with Kim Young-gil, yet another person appointed to conduct the diplomacy across from me, and it was a very unproductive meeting in Stockholm, which was my last engagement with the North Koreans. Now we're going into the Christmas of 2019. It's on the eve of the presidential election kicking off in 2020. North Koreans are really threatening to get our attention. They're going to do a Christmas present. There's a lot of bluff talk about this, and then they go silent, and we wait. and we wait and we wait and nothing happens. We get into mid to late December, probably around the 15th or 20th of December, and China and Russia table a UN Security Council resolution calling for the partial lifting of sanctions in return for North Korean actions on denuclearization. We told the Russians and the Chinese we would if they push it to a vote, we would veto it. I told them, both governments, clearly, yeah, we would be prepared to offer benefits to North Korea if they agree to nuclearize. The problem is they haven't done any denuclearization. Yeah. They're continuing to expand. In fact, they were continuing to expand their nuclear capabilities. Cognitive dissonance notwithstanding, what the Chinese and Russians, in my view, were doing is telling North Koreans that they will be their advocates in the UN Security Council if the North Koreans hold off on any provocation. Yeah. And they may have even quietly passed a tougher message than that. Yeah. Don't do it. You will not have our support. We will not protect you if you do this, and protect you as in condemnation at the UN Security Council or something like that. Whatever it was, it didn't strike me that the North Koreans were in a very happy mood about it, but they didn't do anything. And so it went until the spring that year when they first decided to begin testing ballistic missiles again. Right. And I do credit them with working even not necessarily at our request, but in concert with us to keep open the possibility of a diplomatic outcome.
Yeah, and today perhaps not so much overlap in interests.
Yeah, well, I don't think anybody wants them to. Any of the other parties want them to test a nuclear weapon under any circumstances. Certainly, the Chinese were deeply unhappy with the last nuclear test, the thermonuclear test that the North Koreans did in 2018. But the Russians might be a little more indifferent to that. But again, the Russians have the Chinese to consider as well. I am worried that the Russians are transferring missile technology to the North Koreans, which was one of their shortcomings during that time, was their ability to reliably, they obviously have a nuclear weapon, but their ability to design a system that can reliably deliver it, accurately deliver it, was one of their shortcomings. That'd be very worrisome if that's what the Russians are doing, and I believe that may very well be the case.
Yeah. Well, there have been a number of luminaries that have taken on this very difficult challenge of engaging with North Korea, and you are very much up there in that list of people who have done really valiant, amazing work to push the ball forward under unbelievable constraints and made a measurable difference. It's a very frustrating experience working with the North Koreans. Do you ever miss it?
I can't say I don't know that I miss it, but I don't regret it. Yeah. It was, and to this day, Jonathan, I was always animated by a belief that what we were trying to do was possible. There has to be a different way. Yeah. We have other options on the Korean Peninsula besides diplomacy, but some of it may have just we couldn't get the planets to align. Some of it may be that we ran out of time. Maybe there were mistakes made on both sides that might have prolonged or complicated the diplomacy, and we were close in Hanoi, but ultimately, while it didn't end in acrimony, and while what we had been discussing is still on the table in a sense, is it wasn't rejected. We just couldn't close the deal because the gap was unacceptably large on a roadmap for denuclearization. Yeah. And absent that, none of the rest of it would work for us geopolitically, with our partners and allies, domestically, with our Congress, and quite honestly, I think the president accepted the offer that Chairman Kim had put on the table in Hanoi. I also, I think it would have been the end of our diplomacy. I don't think it would have been politically sustainable in the United States, and it would have led to a collapse of the diplomacy. That another important feature of negotiating, particularly in something that's so complex and important as this, is that you should never agree to anything that you can't sell to your own side. And there's numerous examples of arms control treaties, multilateral treaties, trade agreements that have been negotiated by negotiators, only to fail in convincing the folks back home.
Right.
And while this was never going to be subject to a congressional vote, there were innumerable ways that discontent could have percolated up and picked it apart through sanctions, new sanctions, resolutions, restrictions. And so we worked very hard throughout this process to socialize what we were trying to do with the media, with the expert community. We worked very hard to be completely transparent with the Congress on what we were doing, because we also anticipated that signing on the dotted line with the North Koreans was only the first step in making this happen. And ultimately, we were also focused on execution. We were constantly reviewing our strategy for execution. We had hundreds of people trained, identified, at one point even with all their travel vaccinations ready to go early on to Dongjeongri in Sohae in Punggye-ri to begin the initial steps that North Koreans had actually already committed to open up those facilities for inspection and to confirm the dismantlement of the missile testing and nuclear testing capabilities. Again, another frustration. North Koreans offered and agreed to that several times, and no American ever set foot in any of them, either of them.
It seems like Kim Jong-un perhaps got some bad advice in the run-up to Hanoi, that he could just present this fait accompli and say, here's my offer, take it or leave it. Apparently, he was convinced by somebody, or maybe just had the conviction on his own, that, the Trump administration was going to take that.
The thought has crossed my mind, and I don't have any evidence that is the case. It could have been internal. It could have been an internal confidence it could have been the fact that Singapore was that they ran the table at Singapore and just assumed they'd run the table at Hanoi. There must have been some consideration that the president was just in the final stages of the impeachment proceedings back in the U.S. It might be a thought that he was desperate for a political victory, which I guarantee you he wasn't. Or they might have been told by another party that that had the confidence that they understood, that the other party had a confidence that they understood us. The North Koreans might have been encouraged that, offer this, the Americans will take it. Trump wants that deal, or the Americans will take it. It wasn't lost on me that after Hanoi ended and the two sides returned to their capitals, that the North Koreans said nothing critical about us, but they were harshly critical about the South Korean government. Kim Yo-jong made some biting personal statements about President Moon, and it was, let's just say, inexplicable to us why the North Koreans, after that offer was failed to succeed, why the North Koreans were so angry at South Korea. Because they should have been angry at us. We're the ones that said it's not enough. It makes me wonder where they were getting that advice, if they got it.
Very interesting. Let's open up to our in-person audience for questions. So please raise your hand, identify yourself, and keep your questions question-like. Let's start with Fred over there.
Hi there. I'm Fred. I'm a part of the Kim Koo Fellowship here at the Korea Society. I was particularly interested in you talking about how the more progressive Moon Jae-in administration played into the diplomatic process. Currently, President Yoon has, I believe, from Gallup Korea, 17% approval. There's a lot of discussion about whether he'll even serve the remainder of his term. And I'm curious if you think that a potential more progressive incoming president after him, what impact, if any, this would have on the incoming Trump administration's diplomacy with North Korea?
So I don't know who will succeed President Yoon, but someone will succeed him because he's term limited, and even assuming that he serves out his whole term, which I assume he will, there will be a successor in a couple years during the Trump administration. The President Trump's kind of everyman view of we need to fix this problem aligns with the traditional progressive view that negotiations with North Korea and concessions to North Korea are necessary to achieve peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, to rectify the historical division on the Korean Peninsula. And within the progressives, there's also an element of to reduce South Korea's dependence upon the United States of America. Is traditionally, I don't assign this in any way to President Moon. The voices of anti-Americanism are found in the ranks of the progressive constituencies. So, there will be an alignment there, but it's going to be, that's just one factor. Mm-hmm. Because President Moon was in favor and supportive and even facilitated in important ways negotiations between the United States and North Korea, but at the same time, Japan and South Korea were deeply at odds during this period, which was presented a different set of challenges. And then you still have the factors I described about the complete absence of insights and presence in South Korea, with the complete exodus of diplomats, aid groups, UN organizations. You have the hostility between the United States and Russia, United States and China, which are factors that will impact all this. So we had a remarkable alignment of, in hindsight, well, we knew it at the time too, frankly. It wasn't just hindsight. We had a remarkable alignment that allowed us to test this diplomacy. And who is the president of South Korea, progressive or conservative, is only one small part of that larger constellation.
Well said. Okay. Linda?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Linda. I'm with the UNDPPA political department. My question is, now, given the current environment, thank you so much for describing and sharing your insights. Very interesting. Now, with the new U.S. administration coming in, tensions in the region, what do you think the UN can do? I'm all ears, and happy to hear your recommendations for what can we do to foster dialogue.
So I mentioned all the things that are different, but there's also one truth that probably is the most obvious one of all. The North Koreans get a say in this too, and so nothing happens if the North Koreans don't want to play along, don't want to go along. Traditionally, the North Koreans have not seen the United Nations as the venue in which they want to litigate these kind of things or negotiate these kind of things. They would much prefer to do it on a bilateral basis. Grudgingly, they've agreed to do it in the past in a multilateral basis with the six-party talks, but they weren't happy. They weren't fond of the six-party talks. From North Korea, that was a five plus one, not a six-party. I have thought a lot about whether or not a different paradigm might need to be tried if negotiations were going to start again. For example, European Union, or would Europe play a role? Another possibility is a three-party talk or a new six-party talk. Is that possible? There's so many intervening factors, like the war in Ukraine, like the growing tensions with China. None of those are an easy avenue, but none of it happens if the North Koreans aren't interested, and they have their way of signaling when they're interested. And until they do, we could play a parlor game of what's the best paradigm, but we won't. We really don't know. It would be entirely a hypothetical discussion, and perhaps when the North Koreans decide it's time to engage, they'll also let us know in that process how they intend to do so, if they do. For example, the reason why we ended up with the United Front Department as our counterpart in this negotiation is that they chose their point of entry to be attendance at the Pyeongchang Olympics and opening a dialogue with South Korea. South Korea is not the North Korean Foreign Ministry's remit. It's the United Front Department. It's the Korean people. And so by virtue of that entry point, the UFD became our counterparts all the way until Hanoi. And then they jealously guarded it, incidentally, and they waved off and warned off the foreign ministry at every turn.
Wow.
And the foreign ministry was very careful to not clash with the UFD during that period until the UFD was blamed for the failure to get an agreement at Hanoi, in which, as you mentioned earlier, Jonathan, it switched to the MFA. We don't even know which part of North Korea plans to engage with us, much less what external venue they'll be looking for. I wouldn't rule out the United Nations. I wouldn't rule out a P5. There's any number of options, but all of them, due to some of the intervening events from 2019 or 2020 until now, all of them have challenges that don't make it so obvious that they work, including the UN, quite frankly, because if you make this a P, what does the P5 do on anything these days, considering the contentiousness there? That's not to say UN can't play a helpful role. And the one advantage that the United Nations has generally is that they have the physical presence of North Koreans there, probably strictly policed North Koreans, carefully directed North Koreans, but to the extent that there's any point of contact here in the United States of America geographically, it's the North Korean mission to the UN.
Okay, next. Yep, Marissa.
Hi, I'm Marissa. I'm with the National Committee on North Korea, and I'm also here as a Kim Koo Fellow. So as we've been talking a bit about some of the conventional paths to diplomacy, and as you've explained the process that led up to Hanoi, which has been very enlightening, I wanted to think about perhaps some alternate pathways to diplomacy, such as scientific engagement or exchange, and perhaps also on climate, considering that North Korea has been more active on the international stage on issues of climate. So I guess to boil that down into a question, what is your thoughts on how scientific exchange or perhaps climate diplomacy can play a role in being perhaps stepping stones back to talks or back to denuclearization? And what role do you see that playing in future administrations?
So it certainly seems to me that issues like that, generally, not just climate change in North Korea, the ecological disasters in North Korea deeply affect its ability to even feed its own people. The denuding of the forests has led to the erosion of the soil. The increasing rainfalls, absent any sort of foliage to slow water flows or absorb them, combine to create horrendous flooding. Some of you may have seen, who follow it, may have seen probably what were very severe floods in North Korea in the past few months. But also global health is another issue. That not just with North Korea, but these are areas of potential global cooperation, and they should, in theory, offer an entry point where North Korea can at least begin to open its aperture to what they frequently refer to as the outside world. And it is a striking thing in speaking with the North Koreans how often they use that phrase, incidentally, the outside world. Just it perfectly illustrates how they see themselves and where they see themselves. Is there's North Korea and then there's the outside world. It's all out there. These issues would be, I think, present themselves as the easiest ways to draw the North Koreans into that kind of engagement. And they would only do it with intentionality. They wouldn't do it because they share a deep global concern for changing weather patterns or increasing temperatures. They would do it first and foremost because it's a safe way for them to begin engaging the world. So rather than serving a purpose as a way to draw the North Koreans in, although it will, I think really the most important thing is to watch that space as a bellwether for when the North Koreans are ready to come out. Because I think that's probably the safest. Those are the safest type of issues for them to come out on.
Yep, up front here.
Hi, my name is Sam. I'm part of the Korea Society. My question to you is, during your time as the Deputy Secretary of State, how important was disinformation and fake news in affecting both sides on bringing both sides to the table or not bringing to the table?
Specifically in the context of North Korea?
Yes.
It wasn't an issue for us. The undisciplined communications were misalignment inside our own decision making had potential to be disruptive, but we didn't actually suffer. There were also political attacks. The president's policies were attacked from both the right and the left. President Biden harshly criticized President Trump for the personalized nature of his diplomacy with Chairman Kim. That's not disinformation. Those are policy positions, policy preferences. But it wasn't like we were operating in a vacuum. And while I haven't read it, I understand John Bolton wasn't particularly generous in his review of my performance either in his book. So from the right as well, shall we say, although I'm pretty far right in all honesty. But disinformation was never an issue with us. Good information was always a challenge for us, because North Korea is such an opaque society. So they had too much information on us, and we didn't have enough information on them. That was a bigger issue than fake news or disinformation.
James?
Hi, James Shehun Park. I career advise North Korean defectors. And also, as I've been going to Columbia University Cuba program at SIPA for many years, and just looking at that, if Vietnam is too far advanced, I mean, all the diplomatic and military and everything going on, looking at the Cuba model of the relationship and looking at how Obama administration opened up U.S. and Cuba, but Trump administration changed that. But now going back in, Cuba, it might be something. But now I heard last night, Mark Rubio might be Secretary of State as a highest Latino and Cuban American. And that's what do you think of that? And second part is, who do you think might be the U.S. ambassador to South Korea? And Professor Victor Cha was here, and I asked him that question. And so it's interesting.
So I think you could make some broad judgments about similarities between longstanding tensions, conflicts between the United States and other countries, but only at the highest level. They're so, each is so unique and subject to their own historical set of facts that it's not comparable. I mean, I compared Vietnam with North Korea. You could compare Cuba policy with North Korea policy, obviously, but each one of these is subject to different pressures in solving them. In Cuba issue is undoubtedly affected by the large Cuban diaspora in the United States and in their views of Castro, but also by Cuba's proximity to the U.S. border, and also the unique role that Cuba played in really threatening the United States of America during the Cold War in the 1960s, versus a horrendous full-blown war fought on the Korean Peninsula 70 years ago, and the same with Vietnam 50 years ago. I don't think you can. I think the analogy falls apart pretty quickly because of the unique set of circumstances. But one thing that they all have in common when you have an incoming president like President Trump is he also has that kind of a view that is unconstrained by convention and history that oftentimes is exactly what keeps us from being able to resolve these conflicts. And I mentioned how I could perfectly understand how, coming from his background, when he got his first briefing on the Korean Peninsula, said, run that by me again. This war ended 70 years ago, and we still have 30,000 U.S. troops, and they have a nuclear weapon. And who's been in charge of this? What have they tried to do to fix this or to stop this? And I could see him, quite frankly, saying the same thing about Cuba policy. But then, affected by the other unique circumstances, the demographic makeup in Florida and so on, there's going to be a lot of different influences there.
Okay. Yeah. Nitai.
Hi there. Nitai Detel from the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. I'm interested on kind of continuing to pull your thread on the shifting geopolitical landscape with North Korean soldiers in Ukraine. I know what it means for the Russia-China relationship. I think Dennis Wilder has commented recently about Xi being rightfully not necessarily enjoying the détente or the growing relationship between Pyongyang and Moscow. How you think the Chinese, from your interactions with them, might be viewing this, and is this an opportunity, as Dennis has talked about, potential leverage in here for the U.S. and the Chinese to make some sort of agreement, whether he's talking from more of his old CIA hat as far as opportunities for intelligence collection and cooperation between the Americans and Chinese, and the kind of counter-proliferation angle, kind of what the prospects are, kind of looking forward, projecting into your former colleagues and the former president now coming back to the White House. Thanks.
So I've been to Beijing several times in the last 2 years, and my counterparts, North Korea experts, former officials, they put on a pretty brave face about Russia's cooperation with North Korea. They have struggled a little bit with the friendship without limits that was consummated in February of 2022, just in advance of the Winter Olympics in China. It was very clear in the first months of the war that the Chinese were struggling in their public comments to reconcile some of the core principles of Chinese foreign policy with what Russia was up to in Ukraine. They were tortured by it, and there was a general unhappiness in Beijing that led to the removal of a senior Chinese foreign ministry official who had been seen as the author of the 5,000-word joint statement that was released just in advance of the war. There was plenty of debate, as you know, in the China watcher community about how forthcoming President Putin was with President Xi, whether he told him the extent to which he was intending to invade, or whether he may have signaled, but the Chinese were led to believe it was a negotiating tack. There was a little pressure and then cut a deal. Whatever it was, there was a period of buyer's remorse that was evident in Beijing for almost a full year into the conflict. Some of that was because of the discomfort, in my view, some of that was because of the discomfort the Chinese government had with it, the position it had put itself in. But some of it was also because it must have felt in Beijing like they'd hitched their wagon to a loser, that they were backing the losing side in this war. But as you get into 23, particularly mid-23, that started to change. There's a view in Washington that Russia's success, improved performance on the battlefield, was enabled by Chinese assistance. But I think the converse is also equally true, that Chinese insistence was expanded because of Russian successes on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. It was when the Chinese government started entertaining the possibility that perhaps they hadn't hitched their wagon to a loser. Perhaps they actually had picked the winning side, or at least that Putin Putin had pulled this one out of the coals, and they became a little bit more comfortable with their position and maybe more expansive, according to certainly what our U.S. government is saying, with their assistance. And then you get into 2024, and now North Korea gets into the game. Already in 23, North Korea's delivering munitions, but now obviously North Korea actually has troops, at least in the theater, if not in Ukraine, certainly in fighting against Ukrainians. And so when you go to Moscow, when you go to Beijing, Chinese put on a very brave face about this. Oh, you know, the Russians aren't going to do it. They're not going to cross any lines. And one of the lines I heard from Chinese counterparts is the Russian assistance is tactical but not strategic. That was it was a phrase that was used with me more than one occasion, and I think what they're saying is it's technical assistance with things like their missile program. It's not helping them improve their nuclear weapons capabilities. But I'm actually more worried about the former than the latter. They already have the nuclear weapon. As I said earlier, one of the shortcomings of their system was of their capabilities was their delivery systems. And if the Russians are helping with that, and the Russians are very good at rocketry, that's worrisome. You have to believe the Russians. You have to believe the Chinese are not happy that the Russians are drawing the North Koreans out of China's orbit or giving them leverage in the relationship with China. It's speculation. There's no, in my view, no firm evidence that this is the case. But I have had conversations with senior Chinese former officials who've dismissed what the Russians are doing as an attempt to start mischief on the Korean Peninsula to distract the world from the disaster that they find themselves in Ukraine. So, and I know that there's pockets of sentiment that are worried about this. But I think for the most part, the party line in China is there's nothing to be seen here. We're not worried about Russia, North Korea, and you see it repeated just in recent weeks as the Biden administration has tried to press the Chinese to play a role in pushing back against North Korean deployments. The Chinese will get worried if this stirs up instability on the Korean Peninsula, because it'll take us back to that environment in which they're always most active and interested in resolving the issues. And so, to some extent, it's not going to happen in the waning 2 months of the Biden administration, but how the United States and North Korea juxtapose against each other, the course of the war in Ukraine, all this will have a bearing on not just North Korea, not just Russia, not just Ukraine, but also the larger equation of China. But all that's going to also be part of very likely a major economic negotiation and possibly push back in South China Sea and places like that. It's going to be a very complicated environment for us to say, that will have therefore this particular effect on North Korea negotiations.
So let's do two super fast ones because you've been so generous with your time. Is that okay if we just do
absolutely.
two quick ones? Okay. So Andrew and Cody, super, super fast. We'll take them as a pair.
Hi, yes, Kim Koo Fellow, graduate student, Columbia SIPA. My question was on how relevant discussions of cyber policy were, or cybersecurity policy were on North Korea. We see that a lot of their APT operations center around cyber financial crimes. We see that the PLA has prepositioning efforts on U.S. critical infrastructure. Was South Korea ever worried at all about a transition from cyber criminal activity to potential prepositioning efforts by North Korean APTs? Thank you.
Okay, Cody.
And one more, Cody Griggers from the UN Department of Political Affairs. One of the things that's come up in our series of speakers is this observation that sanctions don't seem to be working for North Korea. And I just wanted to get your assessment of how sanctions are as a tool for North Korea, particularly in light of your observation that one of the things the regime really needs for survival is this feeling that everyone's out to get us or that we're at war with everyone. And do sanctions not sort of feed into that siege mentality, prolonging the life of the regime? Thank you.
So in our negotiations with North Koreans, cyber policy was never a direct topic of discussion. It was very much a topic of our North Korea policy. We took a lot of punitive actions against malign actors in the cyberspace in North Korea, and it was a constant frustration that we would have sanctions that would tighten access to foreign capital and foreign goods in North Korea. But in one cyber theft, they could wipe away months of constraints that we were able to impose upon their economy by just seizing a large amount of money illicitly, and they were quite good at it. They were obviously are very practiced and persistent. Everyone's worried about that. Chinese are worried about it because North Koreans have even preyed on the Chinese in this respect, but South Koreans as well, unfortunately, we're in a world in which we are unable to close that off from any country, much less a sophisticated state actor like North Korea. It's something that we're going to have to continue to develop our own tools to combat against, but we're not there yet. In terms of the effectiveness of sanctions, I've never viewed sanctions as a policy. They're a tool to achieve a policy outcome. So sanctions in isolation, to me, are not going to be particularly effective. They have to be combined with some other set of actions. In the course of our diplomacy with the North Koreans, we saw sanctions as a tool to change North Korean perspectives on the timeline we were operating on. In our democratic systems in South Korea, president has a 5-year mandate, and the U.S. president has a 4-year mandate with the potential for another 4. Kim Jong-un looks at the tenure of his grandfather, 40 plus years, looks at the tenure of his father, about 20 years, and he has to think that, all other things considered, health, et cetera, he's got about 30 years. So if he's sitting there in 2012, 2013, when he's taking power, his timeline goes into the 2040s. And if he runs into an offer that he doesn't like, or a president that he doesn't believe will deliver, he's perfectly fine to wait for the next one. And that's the arc that the North Koreans look at. Our tactic wasn't a strategy. Our tactic was to use sanctions, among other things, to try to compress that timeline. At the same time, we were actively negotiating with the North Koreans in setting up our negotiations to try to allow them to survive the inevitable areas of disagreement or failure. That was the whole idea between our simultaneous parallel work streams, is that we wanted to create enough different avenues for progress that if one slowed or stalled, that others could continue the diplomacy. That we were trying to put a safety net under it so we didn't fall back to no discussions whatsoever. All things are off, which has been the pattern for North Korean negotiations since 1994. Our goal was never to bring the North Korean economy to its knees or to somehow believe that we could force them to capitulate because of economic hardship. For goodness sake, the famine in the 1990s it was unable to do that, and we would hopefully never do anything so cruel as to try to starve the people of North Korea the way they were starved during the so-called arduous march. But the sanctions, absent other policy initiatives, whether they're coercive or diplomatic, strike me as not particularly effective.
Secretary Biegun, you're such a fountain of knowledge. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. You'll have to forgive us for going a little bit over time. It was just so interesting, I couldn't help it.
Don't worry, I was ready to be here this long. Thank you all for coming out today. It's great to have a chance to remember some of these things and flex these muscles. But if you really want to hear the fresh version of it, listen to the NK News podcast or give a browse through the Arms Control Daily interview. That's where I really tried to preserve for whoever succeeds, whoever is a successor in these efforts, some of the experiences that we were talking about today.
Wonderful. So please help me to give a warm round of applause for Secretary Biegun. Thank you so much to all my teammates, Chelsea, Bradley, Nabiha, Tom, our president in the back there. Really appreciate all your help. Kimku Fellows and Korea Study members, please hang out with us. We've got pastries and coffee in the kitchen, and we'll just relax for a little bit. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.